In the winter of 1901, the coal miners of Hollow Creek, Tennessee, discovered something that would haunt their nightmares for decades. Inside the abandoned Whitman farmhouse, they found 7-year-old Emma Whitman sitting peacefully at the kitchen table, quietly eating what remained of her mother. The child looked up at the horrified men with bright, innocent eyes and asked if they wanted to join her for dinner. When they examined what was left of Ruth Whitman, they realized she had been cutting pieces from her own body and feeding them to her daughter for months. And somehow, impossibly, Ruth was still alive, still breathing, still whispering words of love, as her child continued the meal that would never end. The Whitman family had lived in Hollow Creek for 3 generations, farming the rocky Tennessee soil that barely provided enough to survive. The hollow was isolated, nestled between steep mountains that blocked out sunlight for most of the day, leaving the small community perpetually shrouded in shadow. Thomas Whitman had inherited the family farm in 1895, along with his wife Ruth and their infant daughter Emma. The farm was failing, the soil exhausted from years of poor crops, but Thomas was determined to make it work. He had nowhere else to go, and the mountain folk of Hollow Creek didn't welcome outsiders. Ruth Whitman was a devoted mother who would do anything for her child. She had grown up in poverty herself, knowing the gnawing hunger that kept children awake at night and the desperate measures parents took to keep their families fed. When Emma was born, Ruth made a promise that her daughter would never know that kind of suffering. It was a promise that would cost her everything. The first sign of trouble came in the autumn of 1900. The potato crop failed completely, destroyed by an early frost that caught the entire valley unprepared. Thomas had put everything into those potatoes, counting on them to carry the family through winter. When the black, rotting plants emerged from the frozen ground, he knew they were in serious trouble. The other farmers in Hollow Creek were struggling too, but most had family connections and support networks that the Whitmans lacked. Thomas had married into the community, but Ruth was still considered an outsider after 6 years. When the harsh winter set in and food became scarce, neighbors helped their own first. By December, the Whitman family was surviving on thin soup made from whatever scraps Ruth could find. Emma, now 6 years old, was growing thin and weak. She cried constantly from hunger, and Ruth watched her daughter waste away with the helpless desperation of a mother who had no way to provide. Thomas tried hunting in the mountains, but game was scarce, and he was competing with every other desperate man in the valley. He traveled to nearby towns looking for work, but the economic depression had left few opportunities. Each day, he returned home empty-handed to find his wife and daughter growing more gaunt. Ruth began skipping meals entirely, giving her small portions to Emma. But even that wasn't enough. The little girl was fading before her eyes, and Ruth felt her maternal instincts transforming into something darker and more desperate. It was on Christmas Eve, 1900, that Ruth first cut herself. Emma had been crying for hours, begging for food that didn't exist. Ruth held her daughter's skeletal frame and felt something break inside her mind. The promise she had made at Emma's birth echoed in her thoughts. Her child would never go hungry. Never. Ruth went to the kitchen and took Thomas's hunting knife from the drawer. Without hesitation, she made a small cut on her forearm, just deep enough to draw blood. She let the blood drip into a cup of water, creating a thin red broth that she fed to Emma with a spoon. "Mama's special soup," Ruth whispered as Emma drank eagerly. "Mama will always take care of you." The blood seemed to satisfy Emma in a way that nothing else had for weeks. She stopped crying and fell into a peaceful sleep, the first rest she'd had in days. Ruth bandaged her arm and told herself it was temporary, just until Thomas found work, just until the spring crops came in. But winter stretched on, and Ruth's cuts became deeper. Thomas noticed his wife growing weaker, but Ruth blamed it on their poor diet. She wore long sleeves to hide the growing collection of wounds on her arms and legs. Each night, when Thomas was asleep, she would carefully cut small pieces of flesh from places he wouldn't see and feed them to Emma. The child's appetite grew stronger with each feeding. Emma began asking specifically for Mama's special food, rejecting the few scraps of regular food they managed to find. Ruth told herself it was because her blood contained nutrients that Emma needed. Mother's milk was natural, she reasoned. This was just another way of nourishing her child. But deep down, Ruth knew something had changed in both of them, something that went beyond simple survival. Emma was getting stronger while Ruth weakened, but not in any natural way. The child's eyes had taken on an unusual brightness, and she moved with energy that seemed impossible given their circumstances. She rarely slept anymore, spending long hours staring at Ruth with an expression that was both loving and hungry. "I love you, Mama," Emma would whisper while tracing the bandages on Ruth's arms. "You taste like love." Ruth's wounds healed slowly, if at all. Some seemed to remain open no matter how she bandaged them, as if her body was preparing itself to provide constant nourishment. She grew pale and thin, but somehow she didn't die. Even as she fed pieces of herself to her daughter, Ruth remained conscious and aware, driven by a maternal instinct that had twisted into something unnatural. By February, Ruth was cutting deeper, taking actual flesh instead of just blood. She would slice small pieces from her thighs and arms, cooking them into stews that Emma devoured with increasing enthusiasm. The pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the joy Ruth felt watching her daughter eat. Thomas was away more often now, desperately searching for work in neighboring counties. When he was home, he was usually too exhausted to pay close attention to his family's strange behavior. Ruth made sure to feed Emma her special meals only when they were alone. If you're finding this tale of maternal devotion turned horrific as compelling as it is disturbing, make sure to subscribe for more stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child. The transformation in both mother and child accelerated through the spring. Ruth's body had adapted to its gruesome purpose in ways that defied medical explanation. Her flesh regenerated slowly but surely, allowing her to continue feeding Emma without dying from blood loss. The wounds would close partially, then reopen when it was time for the next feeding. Emma had grown into something that wasn't quite human anymore. She looked healthier than she had in months, but her behavior had become increasingly disturbing. She spoke about hunger constantly, not for regular food, but specifically for her mother. She would sit for hours watching Ruth with predatory attention, as if calculating which piece she wanted to try next. "Mama's arm looks tender today," Emma would say with innocent sweetness. "Can we have arm tonight?" Ruth found herself looking forward to these requests. The act of cutting herself had become ritualistic, almost religious. She felt closest to her daughter during their private meals, when she could provide exactly what Emma needed in the most direct way possible. The pain had transformed into something else, something that felt like love made manifest. When Thomas returned in April with news of temporary work at a lumber mill, he found his family changed beyond recognition. Ruth was gaunt and pale, moving carefully as if every step caused pain. But Emma was vibrant and healthy, with bright eyes and rosy cheeks that seemed impossible given their circumstances. "Ruth's been taking good care of me," Emma told her father with a smile that revealed teeth that seemed sharper than before. "She gives me special food that makes me strong." Thomas assumed Ruth had been hoarding food to ensure Emma's survival. He was grateful for his wife's sacrifice, not realizing the literal truth of his daughter's words. When he offered to take over meal preparation, both Ruth and Emma became agitated. "Mama knows what I like," Emma insisted. "Nobody else can make it right." Ruth nodded agreement, clutching her bandaged arms protectively. "Emma has specific needs. I understand her appetite better than anyone." Thomas accepted this explanation, focused on the lumber work that might finally provide steady income. He left early each morning and returned exhausted each night, giving Ruth and Emma plenty of time for their private feeding rituals. But the arrangement was becoming unsustainable. Ruth was running out of flesh to spare, and Emma's appetite was growing stronger. What had started with small cuts and drops of blood had escalated to substantial pieces of muscle and tissue. Ruth knew she was approaching some kind of biological limit, but the thought of denying Emma food was unbearable. "I need more, Mama," Emma whispered one evening while they sat together in the kitchen. "The little pieces aren't enough anymore." I'm still hungry. Ruth looked at her daughter's bright, expectant face and felt her heart break with love and desperation. She picked up the knife and made a deeper cut than ever before, slicing away a piece of flesh from her forearm the size of a silver dollar. Emma ate it eagerly, but within minutes she was asking for more. Still hungry, Mama. Still need more. Ruth cut again and again and again. Each piece Emma consumed seemed to increase her appetite rather than satisfy it. As the night wore on, Ruth found herself carving away larger and larger portions of her own body, driven by Emma's continued requests for more. By dawn, Ruth had removed most of the muscle from her left forearm, exposing bone in several places. But she was still alive, still conscious, still able to provide for her child's needs. The pain had become a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by the maternal satisfaction of seeing Emma well-fed and content. Thomas returned from work that evening to find Ruth sitting quietly in her chair, her left arm wrapped in blood-soaked rags. Emma played happily on the floor, healthier and more energetic than he'd ever seen her. "What happened to your arm?" Thomas asked, concerned by the amount of blood on the bandages. "Cut myself while cooking," Ruth replied calmly. "Nothing serious. Emma needed feeding." Thomas accepted the explanation, too tired to investigate further. But over the following weeks, he began to notice more changes in his family. Ruth's injuries seemed to multiply rather than heal. She moved like someone in constant pain, but she insisted she was fine whenever he asked. Emma's behavior grew stranger as well. She refused to eat regular food entirely now, claiming it made her sick. She would only accept meals that Ruth prepared in private, and these meals seemed to satisfy her completely despite their small size. "What exactly are you feeding her?" Thomas asked one evening after watching Emma turn away from a plate of beans and cornbread. "Special soup," Ruth answered, "made with ingredients that help her grow strong." "What ingredients?" Ruth's eyes held secrets that Thomas couldn't read. Things only a mother can provide. Thomas might have investigated further, but the lumber work demanded long hours and physical exhaustion that left little energy for family concerns. He was grateful that Ruth had found a way to keep Emma healthy during their difficult times, and he trusted his wife to know what was best for their child. The truth was revealed on a November morning when Thomas returned home unexpectedly, having been injured in an accident at the lumber mill. He walked into the kitchen to find Ruth sitting at the table with a sharp knife, carefully slicing flesh from her thigh while Emma watched with eager anticipation. "Ruth, what in God's name are you doing?" Ruth looked up at her husband with eyes that held no shame, only maternal devotion. "Feeding our daughter, like I promised I always would." Thomas stared in horror as Ruth placed the piece of her own flesh into a small pot of boiling water. Emma clapped her hands excitedly, clearly familiar with this routine. "She needs this," Ruth explained calmly. "Regular food doesn't satisfy her anymore. Only this works. Only what I can give her." Thomas grabbed the knife from Ruth's hand and threw it across the room. "This is madness. You're killing yourself." "I'm not dying," Ruth replied. "Look at me, Thomas. I should be dead by now, but I'm not. I'm exactly what Emma needs me to be." Thomas examined his wife more closely and realized she was right. Despite the obvious wounds and blood loss, Ruth was alive and functioning. Weak, certainly, but not dying. It was as if her body had adapted to serve this impossible purpose. "And look at Emma," Ruth continued. "Have you ever seen her healthier? Have you ever seen her happier? I'm giving her exactly what she needs." Thomas looked at his daughter, who was watching the conversation with bright, intelligent eyes. Emma seemed older than her 7 years, possessed of an awareness that was both childlike and ancient. "Papa doesn't understand," Emma said sweetly. "Mama's food is special." "It makes me grow strong and smart. Regular food is for regular children." "What are you saying?" Thomas demanded. "I'm not a regular child anymore," Emma explained with patient simplicity. "Mama's love changed me, made me better. Now I need her special food to stay strong." Thomas backed away from his family, finally understanding that whatever was happening in his house went beyond simple hunger or desperation. This was something supernatural, something that had transformed both his wife and daughter into creatures he no longer recognized. "Ruth, we have to stop this," he pleaded. "Whatever's happening here, it's not natural. It's not right." "It's love," Ruth replied firmly. "It's what mothers do. We sacrifice for our children. I'm just doing it more directly than most." Thomas tried to take Emma away from the house, but the child refused to leave. When he attempted to carry her, she bit him with teeth that had indeed grown sharper, drawing blood that she licked eagerly from her lips. "I can't leave Mama," Emma said. "I need her, and she needs me to need her. It's how we love each other now." Thomas fled the house and rode to town, desperate to find help. But when he tried to explain what was happening, people assumed he was suffering from exhaustion or mental breakdown. The few who believed his story suggested he contact the county sheriff, but Thomas knew no law enforcement could address what his family had become. When he returned to the farmhouse 3 days later with the sheriff and a doctor, they found Ruth and Emma exactly where he'd left them. Ruth was sitting peacefully at the kitchen table, her body covered in bandages, but her expression serene. Emma sat beside her, healthy and bright-eyed, quietly eating from a small bowl. The doctor examined Ruth and found wounds that should have been fatal but had somehow stabilized. She was conscious and coherent, speaking about her daughter with obvious love and pride. "She's growing so well," Ruth told the doctor, "getting stronger every day. A mother's job is to nourish her children, and I've found a way to do that perfectly." The sheriff asked Emma what she was eating, and the child looked up with innocent eyes. "Mama's special food," she said. "It's made with love. Would you like to try some?" The men examined the contents of Emma's bowl and found small pieces of what appeared to be human flesh in a thin broth. When they confronted Ruth about it, she showed no shame or distress. "It's what she needs," Ruth explained. "What she's always needed. I was just too ignorant to understand before, but hunger taught me. Desperation showed me the way." The doctor tried to take Emma away from Ruth, but the child became violently agitated, screaming that she would starve without her mother's special food. When they attempted to separate them by force, Ruth collapsed entirely, as if her life force was somehow connected to her ability to provide for Emma. "You can't take her from me," Ruth gasped. "I exist to feed her now. It's all I am, all I want to be." The authorities were faced with an impossible situation. They couldn't prove any crime had been committed, since Ruth was harming herself voluntarily. They couldn't remove Emma from her mother's care without causing apparent harm to both of them. And they couldn't explain what they were witnessing in any rational terms. In the end, they decided to leave the family alone, with instructions for Thomas to monitor the situation and report any changes. But Thomas never returned to the farmhouse. He abandoned his wife and daughter to their unnatural relationship, unable to bear witness to what love had made them. Ruth and Emma lived alone in the hollow for several more months, perfecting their symbiotic arrangement. Ruth's body continued to regenerate just enough to sustain Emma's appetite, while Emma grew stronger and more intelligent with each feeding. But the relationship was slowly consuming Ruth entirely. By spring, she was more wounds than flesh, held together by some supernatural force that kept her alive purely to serve her daughter's needs. Emma had grown into something that resembled a child, but possessed knowledge and awareness far beyond her years. The coal miners found them in March, when they came to survey the hollow for potential mining operations. They discovered a house that looked abandoned from the outside, but sounds of conversation drew them to investigate. Inside, they found a scene that would haunt their nightmares forever. Ruth Whitman was still alive, though barely recognizable as human. Most of her body had been systematically removed and consumed, leaving behind a collection of bones and organs held together by determination and unnatural maternal love. Emma sat beside what remained of her mother, carefully eating with the precise manners of a well-raised child. She looked up at the horrified miners with bright, satisfied eyes. "Hello," she said politely. "Mama and I are having dinner. Would you like to join us?" Ruth turned her head toward the visitors, her face gaunt, but her eyes filled with maternal pride. "Emma's grown so strong," she whispered. "I've given her everything she needed." Everything I had to give. The miners fled the house and reported their discovery to authorities. But when officials returned to investigate, they found the farmhouse empty. Ruth and Emma had vanished, leaving behind only bloodstains and the lingering smell of love turned monstrous. Some say they died that winter, finally reaching the natural end of their impossible relationship. Others believe they moved deeper into the mountains where Ruth could continue providing for Emma away from the judgment of the outside world. But the most disturbing reports come from isolated families throughout the Tennessee mountains who speak of a pale woman and her bright-eyed daughter appearing at their doors during harsh winters. They ask for shelter and offer to share their food in return. The woman is always thin and weak, covered in bandages that hide wounds that never heal. The child is always healthy and strong, with eyes that seem to see too much and an appetite that regular food cannot satisfy. Families who welcome them report strange dreams about sacrifice and love, about the lengths parents will go to ensure their children's survival. Some wake to find small cuts on their arms or legs, wounds they don't remember making. Their children begin asking for special food that tastes like love and devotion. The pale woman always leaves before dawn, taking her daughter with her, but she leaves behind a hunger that spreads through the household like an infection, a need that regular nourishment cannot fill. In Hollow Creek, where the coal mines eventually consumed the valley where the Whitman farm once stood, old-timers still warn their children about the woman who loved too much and the daughter who could never be satisfied. They say that true maternal love knows no bounds, no limits, no point at which sacrifice becomes too great. They say Ruth Whitman proved that love can transform anyone into exactly what their child needs, regardless of the cost. But they also warn that some hungers, once awakened, can never be truly fed. And sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls through the mountains, you can still hear a mother's voice whispering words of love and devotion, promising to give everything she has and everything she is to ensure her child never knows want.
The question isn't whether Ruth Whitman's love was real, or if her sacrifice was meaningful.
The question is what you would be willing to become if your own child looked at you with hungry eyes and whispered that they needed something only you could.